Wonder if after the festivities and all the food over the holidays, maybe you've been walking a bit, just to try and get rid of those few extra pounds. And maybe you've got a favourite place that you like to walk. Maybe it's down at the Loch Shore, down at Whiteabbey. Maybe you like to go there. Maybe you like the scenery. You might meet people that you know, have a chat with old friends. Or maybe you like to go up the north coast and have a drive there and maybe walk round the areas of Portstewart or Portrush. And it's nice to do that. It's, I suppose, something that all of us do from time to time. We all have somewhere that we like to go. It might be beside the sea. It might be where there's trees. Maybe it's the company. But it can really refresh us. And I think it's probably the same when it comes to those favourite passages in the Bible that we return to time and time again. Passages that inspire us and comfort us, console us, and encourage us as we seek to live for the Lord day by day. It might be a psalm. It might be an Old Testament character. It might be a parable of Jesus, or maybe a miracle. It might be the book of Revelation. Well, a passage that I love to return to is the one that we read this morning in Hebrews chapter 11. And the reason that I love to go back there is because it really reminds me of what lies at the very heart of what we are as Christian people. It brings us back to basics. And I think it gives us the secret of the Christian life. People believe that there is a secret, and I think this is it. It tells us what is the beginning and the middle and the end, the sum and substance of what God calls us to be. And I think we need to return to this repeatedly. And as we enter into the new year, as we stand on the threshold of 2013, in one sense it's just another day as the clock moves forward, but it's also an opportunity, isn't it, to take stock and to remind ourselves of what is the essence of what we are as Christian people. What is it that will sustain us through the years in the different circumstances of life? Now, it may sound simplistic and very elementary and possibly even a little bit childish, but it's crucial. And it's that word that we thought about with the children. It is faith. There is no doubt whatsoever that faith is fundamental to what we are as God's people. It goes to the very core of what the church is and what we stand for and what we proclaim. And the passage that we read together earlier on gave us this verse. It said, by faith the ancients did all those things. And it says this is what the ancients were commended for. They were commended for their faith. So whatever else they were and whatever else they did, this is what distinguished them and set them apart from others. It was this which empowered them and motivated them and marked them out as the people that they were. And then the writer to Hebrews goes on in this passage to give us a list, a catalogue of those who by faith did the things that they were involved in. And it tells us in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 6, without faith it is impossible to please God. It is an essential ingredient if we are to bring pleasure to the living God by our lives. It's the way that we start on the Christian path. It's the way that we press on. It's the key to living for God. It's as old as the hills and as new as this morning's sunrise. And we need to keep it before us constantly. Because sometimes we think that there is something that we haven't yet discovered. There's some experience that we haven't yet had that will really help us and be the key to living for God. And everything will be simple after that. Well, here is the key. And the writer to the Hebrews is aware that some of the people that he's writing to, they're beginning to waver. And they're beginning to doubt. And in chapter 3 and verse 12, he says to them, see to it that none of you have a sinful, unbelieving heart. So he recognizes that there's a danger for them. And then he says in verse 14 of that chapter, we have come to share in Christ if we hold firmly till the end the confidence we had at first. And we find the same thing throughout other chapters in Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 14. He says, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. In chapter 10 and verse 35, he says these words, so do not throw away your confidence. It will be richly rewarded. In verse 36, he says, for in just a very little while he who is coming will come and will not delay, but my righteous one will live by faith. And if he shrinks back, I will not be pleased with him. So this is our calling, to keep going, to press on. That's what the writer is saying to the Hebrews, and God is saying to us. And what will sustain us and enable us to persevere is faith. And that's why he then goes on to talk about the great cloud of witnesses. Now, I just want to ask two questions this morning. First of all, I want to ask the question, what is faith? It's one thing to say that it's crucial, and it's what the ancients were commended for. It's easy to say it lies at the core of what we are as Christians, but how would we describe it? Well, it's clear from these words that faith is not about seeing. It is not about seeing. It is not a response that is based on any visible evidence that we might be able to have. The writer said it's being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. Now, in our scientific age, people need proof. They need to be convinced by some visual demonstration. They say, show me and I'll believe. If I can see something, if God will do something that will enable me to conclude, there is God, then I will really believe. Well, let me remind you that faith or sight is no guarantee of faith. Because if we went back to chapter 3 in the book of Hebrews, he talks about the people who left Egypt. And they saw all the plagues. They saw the sea opened. They saw God giving them manna and quail. They saw the hand of God provide for them. They had seen everything. If ever anybody had proof, it was them. But they were disqualified from entering into the promised land. And Hebrews 3 and verse 19 says, they did not enter because of their unbelief. So they had lots of visual pieces of evidence, but they still didn't believe. And in chapter 4, he says that they heard the gospel. We also have had the gospel preached to us just as they did. That was the early gospel, the people in the Old Testament, just as they did. But the message they heard was of no value to them. Why? Because those who heard it did not combine it with faith. They didn't combine the evidence and the gospel with faith. And we see the same in the New Testament, don't we? Jesus did many miracles. Lots of evidence for people. Some were amazed, but many had no faith. Remember, it tells us it is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. Remember when John wrote his gospel, he said, you have seen and believed, but blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. And he said, I write these things in the gospel, in my story about Jesus, so that you may believe, you may have faith. Peter said, even though you have not seen him yet, you love him. He said, we have seen, you haven't. And we're filled, and you're filled with an inexpressible joy. Now, what is faith? It's not believing because we choose to believe something. It's not a matter of saying, well, I believe A and you believe B, and my belief is just as good as yours, and yours is as good as mine. So if we believe, then that's fine. Neither is faith a special kind of feeling. It's not about working up a certain emotion, because feelings are unreliable. Neither is it saying, if we believe enough, it will be true. That's wishful thinking, isn't it? Hoping against hope. Now, you see, we have got good reason to believe. Faith is not trusting despite the evidence. It's not like the person who puts their head in the sand. You know, we use that expression. The ostrich apparently is supposed to, when it sees danger, instead of running from the danger, sometimes it puts its head in the sand so it can't see the danger. And it thinks the danger isn't there. And we talk about people putting their head in the sand. In other words, they don't want to look at the evidence. Faith is not about putting your head in the sand. We have a reasoned faith. Well, what is it? Well, it's a settled conviction about the identity and the person and the nature and the work of Jesus Christ. It is being persuaded that he is central to the dealings of God with people. It's to be persuaded that in Jesus Christ, God reached out to our world. We've celebrated the incarnation just this week. And later on in the year, we will celebrate Easter, the death and resurrection of Christ. Every Sunday we come is because of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So faith is to be persuaded that God is committed to our world, that he has invested himself in it, and that he gives us life through the one whom he sent. The Old Testament predicted it, doesn't it? God's Gospels portrayed it. Letters that we have in the New Testament explain it. Revelation anticipates those things that are to come, but it's all about him. And that's why the writer to the Hebrews began in chapter 1 with Jesus Christ. That's where he started. He said God spoke to us in the past by the prophets, but now by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom he made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. And he goes on, speaking eloquently about Jesus Christ. That's why he started there. First and foremost, you see, faith is a conviction of our minds. It is a fixed disposition of the soul. But that, of course, is not faith in the Bible's term, because faith is a response to what we believe to be true. It is like the car that goes on to the ferry. Now, go back, sit in the car, and say, yes, I believe. But they never respond in trust and faith. And yes, we do need to be persuaded about those truths concerning Jesus Christ, but we also need to be united to him in our hearts. We need to be convinced that all that's described in the Scriptures, all that's promised to those who belong to him is true. Sure of what we hope for, certain of what we do not see. Michael Card wrote this: to hear with the heart, to see with the soul, to be guided by a hand we cannot hold. That's what faith must be. And that's what sustains us. Remember, faith is not dependent on results. God does not have to prove himself. We don't believe because God does what we want. God has already proved himself. Began in the book of Genesis and continues right through the Scriptures and right into the book of Revelation. And supremely, God has proved himself on Calvary when he gave his only Son for us. Paul said in Romans, he who did not spare his own Son but gave him up for us all, how will he not also along with him graciously give us all things? Friends, this is the key, the secret to persevering in the Christian life. It's this that will enable us to press on and to hold firm right to the end. There's no magic wand. There's no special formula. It is a daily walk of faith in Jesus Christ and in the promises of God, being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. That's what faith is. And secondly, and more briefly, what are the results of faith? Well, the rest of the chapter really tells us, doesn't it? It's a catalogue of the men and the women of the Old Testament who were people of faith. They're examples of faith to inspire us. And all of these people would have been familiar to the recipients of this letter, the Hebrews. They would have been household names. And some of these Hebrews were being tempted to go back to the old ways, to the temple and all of the sacrifice and all of those things. And the first thing we notice is that as we read through the list of those who by faith are presented to us, we notice that it shows in their action. It affected how they lived, determined what they did with their lives, how they decided what was important to them. Basic principle that the writer is telling us is that real faith has a visible dimension. Begins in the mind, filters to the heart, but then has an outward effect in our lives. Came across this illustration, which is humorous, and yet I think it makes the point. I'll just read it to you. In college, I was asked to prepare a lesson to teach my speech class. We were to be graded on our creativity and ability to drive home a point in a memorable way. The title of my talk was The Law of the Pendulum. I spent 20 minutes carefully teaching the physical principle that governs a swinging pendulum. The law of the pendulum is this: a pendulum can never return to a point higher than the point from which it was released. Because of friction and gravity, when the pendulum returns, it will always fall short of its original place or point of release. Each time it swings, it makes less and less of an arc until finally it is at rest. This point of rest is called the state of equilibrium, where all forces acting on the pendulum are equal. I attached a 3-foot string to a child's toy top and secured it to the top of the blackboard with a thumbtack. I pulled the top to one side and made a mark on the blackboard where I let it go. Each time it swung back, I made a new mark. It took less than a minute for the top to complete its swinging and come to rest. When I finished the demonstration, the markings on the blackboard proved my thesis. I then asked how many people in the room believed the law of the pendulum was true. All of my classmates raised their hands, so did the teacher. He started to walk to the front of the room thinking the class was over. In reality, it had just begun. Hanging from the steel ceiling beams in the middle of the room was a large, crude but functional pendulum. 250 pounds of metal weights tied to 4 strands of 500-pound test parachute cord. I invited the instructor, the teacher, to climb up on a table and sit in a chair with the back of his head against a cement wall. Then I brought the 250 pounds of metal up to his nose. Holding the huge pendulum just a fraction of an inch from his face, I once again explained the law of the pendulum he had applauded only moments before. If the law of the pendulum is true, then when I release this mass of metal, it will swing across the room and return short of the release point. Your nose will be in no danger. After that final statement of this law, I looked him in the eye and asked, "Sir, do you believe this law is true?" There was a long pause. Huge beads of sweat formed on his upper lip. And then weakly he nodded and whispered, "Yes." I released the pendulum. It made a swishing sound as it arced across the room. At the far end of its swing, it paused momentarily and started back. I never saw a man move so fast in my life. He literally dived from the table, deftly stepping around the still swinging pendulum. I asked the class, does he believe in the law of the pendulum? The students unanimously shouted, no. It's true, isn't it? If he had really, really believed that law, he would have sat where he was. That would have been the outward response. That's why the writer to the Hebrews then goes through all those people who demonstrated faith. He talks about Abraham. He talks about Joseph. He talks about Moses. He talks about the Apostle Paul. I'm not going into the details. You can read them there for yourselves. Apostle Paul, writing to the Galatians, said, the life I live is the life of faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. To Timothy, he said, hold on to faith. And later in that letter he said to Timothy, I have fought the good fight of faith. He said, I've kept the faith to the end. The Apostle Paul, that great missionary, the man who, under the inspiration of God, gave us much of the New Testament, he said, I've lived life by faith. You might say to me, well, it's all right for those people in Hebrews. They were very special people, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and all those people, they were special. They were made of different stuff. Well, you know, it's not true. I think the reason that the writer of the Hebrews mentions all these people was not only because the recipients of the letter would know them, but because in many ways they were ordinary, sinful people just like us. And maybe you can think of people that you have known, people in Abbott's Cross, maybe people in your family, and you would say they were people of faith. Through difficult times, they pressed on. They kept going. They trusted. They were people who had faith in God in all circumstances. There's a great encouragement and inspiration to us, isn't it? Let me finish by just saying some of the things that faith will enable us to do. Faith will decide our priorities, won't it? What's important to us, what matters most, what we invest ourselves in and what we live for. Faith will keep us worshiping because we're certain of what we do not see. The one that we know by faith, we believe, is worthy of all that we give him. And even though our faith is weak at times, we know that he receives it and welcomes our worship. Faith will keep us loving because we're sure that we're loved by Christ, and our desire is to demonstrate that love to others so that they might have it also. Faith will keep us giving because we're convinced that when we give to God, it's not wasted, it's never lost. It brings pleasure to him, and it can be used to extend his kingdom. Faith will keep us praying because we're certain that in the spiritual battle, these are the weapons that God has given to us. Prayer is mysterious, but we believe that God has built prayer into his purposes for us. Faith will keep us obeying because we're certain that we have a master to serve that we have not seen. Yet we know him in our hearts, and we long to please him. And we're sure that he will reward faithfulness. Faith will keep us sharing the gospel because we're convinced that it is the only hope for a lost world around us. And it's the only way that people can enter and see that world that is hidden from their sight. And faith will keep us serving, certain that we have a master who we've never seen, and yet who delights in our service and in our love for him. You know, there's a time when faith will be no more. It will not be needed. It will give way to sight. Because instead of believing and instead of trusting and instead of having faith in the things that we do not see, we will see him as he is. And that's why the writer to Hebrews finishes, after he's spoken of all the great people of faith, he says, so let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God.